Russia and America are two names that always suggest hostility and conflict when mentioned in the same sentence. But what if we told you that despite all this tension, the two countries never had a direct military confrontation throughout the last century? Nuclear deterrence kept them from going to war and created one of the most complex and important relationships in the modern global system. Contrary to popular belief, the hostility between the two countries was not eternal. Their history includes moments of friendship and alliance, especially when both were still emerging as influential players on the global stage. In fact, their bilateral relationship began early, with the Declaration of Independence by George Washington from British rule. A message from Russian Tsar Alexander I to U.S. President Thomas Jefferson in 1802 reflects the friendly tone of their early relations. I have always looked with pride upon your nation, which has known how to use its independence for good by establishing a free and wise constitution that guarantees the well-being of both the individual and society. After that, trade was opened between the two countries to build an alliance that could challenge British dominance in the world. What strengthened their relationship even more was France's expansion under Napoleon and Russia's sense of threat. As mutual interest between Russia and America grew, it was decided to establish full diplomatic relations. The result of this cooperation was Washington's political alignment with its new friend when the Crimean War broke out between Russia on one side and the Ottoman Empire, Britain and France on the other. Later, when the Poles, supported by European powers, rose up against Russian rule and sent ships to attack the Russian Navy, Russia trusted no country but the United States to transfer part of its fleet to American waters, fearing its destruction. The plan worked and kept the Russian ships safe. But in the 19th century, growing differences in interest began to create a rift in the relationship, as both sides competed for influence over China and several regions in East Asia. This led the United States to move closer to its former rival Britain, especially as America was becoming a rising political and economic power. This marked the beginning of what would become the core of the Western Alliance. World War I broke out, and the German threat provided both sides with sufficient reason to set their differences aside and cooperate against a common enemy. However, this closeness was short-lived. In 1917, the Communist Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin shook Europe, and Russia embraced communism as its new global ideology, turning away from the path of liberalism and free trade. On the other hand, Washington did not recognize the new Soviet regime until 1933, after Franklin Roosevelt became President of the United States. However, with the rise of Nazi Germany, both America and the Soviet Union once again set aside their differences to face their common enemy. The end of World War II and the fall of Nazi Germany marked three major shifts that shaped the future relationship between America and the Soviet Union, and the world around them. First, the dismantling of German power and the disappearance of their common enemy. Second, the British Empire was shattered, losing much of its global dominance along with the vast majority of its colonies. And third, all of this left only two superpowers at the top of global influence: the United States and the Soviet Union. At this point, the major turning point known as the Cold War began. The hostility reached its peak during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, close to the American coast. This nearly triggered a nuclear war, but in the end, diplomacy managed to resolve the crisis. Over the following years, the two superpowers began to develop channels of communication and coordination to avoid nuclear conflict and prevent another crisis like Cuba. This led to the birth of the détente policy, which helped resolve the conflict in Vietnam. But as usual, the relationship soon grew tense again, this time due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and Washington's support for the Mujahideen there. This war coincided with the Soviet Union's decline, which eventually led to its collapse. In the new world that emerged, the United States stood alone at the top of the global order, reshaping the world according to its own vision. As Russia's economic and military power sharply declined, the Russians expressed a desire to open a new chapter with America. But the U.S. had a different view. Hostility toward Russia was deeply rooted in the halls of American power. The U.S. expanded as much as possible into former Soviet republics, taking advantage of Moscow's weakness and aiming to prevent its return as a major power. The American academic of Russian origin, Andrei C. Yanov, even described this deep-rooted hostility as Russophobia. This hostility within Washington's institutions rested on three main pillars. The first was a group of liberal interventionists who viewed the Russian state, shaped by both Soviet and Tsarist legacies, as an authoritarian threat to freedom. They believed it had to be restrained and that liberal democracy should be expanded in the surrounding region. The second were the military hardliners, who saw Russia as a global power with imperial ambitions and believed the U.S. had to take a firm stand against it. Finally, there were American officials of Eastern European origin, many of whom carried a deep-seated animosity toward Russia due to its historical domination of their native countries. After the September 11th attacks and the launch of the War on Terror by President George W. Bush, both the United States and Russia saw counterterrorism as a shared objective that might bridge their long-standing differences. The U.S. expressed support for Russia's actions in Chechnya, while Russia backed the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. However, it soon became clear to Moscow that the War on Terror was an overly broad and ambiguous concept, one that masked Washington's deeper ambitions for global influence. These ambitions became more evident with the U.S. invasion of Iraq and NATO's expansion to include three former Soviet republics in the Baltic region. In response, and with Vladimir Putin's rise to power, Russia embarked on a project to reassert control over its former Soviet sphere. Putin prioritized rebuilding the military and reinforcing state institutions as part of this strategic shift. The first chapter of Russia's confrontation with the West was the war in Georgia, when Russia took control of the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Then came the Crimean War, during which Russia annexed the strategically located peninsula. This led to a wave of Western sanctions against Moscow. Finally, the war in Ukraine escalated the situation further, with Washington and the West intensifying their economic sanctions to the point of nearly isolating Russia from the rest of the world. All of that did not stop Russia from continuing its military operation in Ukraine. In addition, over the past decade, it has supported far-right movements as part of efforts to weaken Western alliances and promote the rise of isolationist nationalism. Russian influence, both political and financial, has become clearly visible in both Europe and the United States. After more than 2 centuries of relations between the two global powers, the current moment marks one of the most intense and fraught periods since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What sets this era apart, however, is the lack of a unified American approach to dealing with Russia, at a time when both countries are grappling with internal social and economic challenges. The situation is further complicated by the rise of China and its growing alignment with Moscow, alongside the increasing pressure on American influence across multiple global fronts. Amid increasingly tense regional and global conditions, the situation is further inflamed by a renewed arms race and repeated nuclear threats. As for what the future holds, the conflict may either escalate into a prolonged and exhausting standoff, one that risks spiraling into a broader and more catastrophic war, or it may guide both sides, whose history includes moments of pragmatic cooperation, back towards something warmer than a cold handshake and a forced smile for the cameras.